as I was sifting through the research on metatarsal stress fractures in running, the metatarsals are the long, thin bones that line the top of the foot as shown here. I noticed that there was a lot of published data on stress fractures of the first and second metatarsal head was actually very common in heel strike runners, but not so much in forefoot strike runners. So I wanted to find out the main risk factors primarily responsible for a heel strike runner potentially having a more pronounced outsized risk of a metatarsal stress fracture of the first and second metatarsal head, which is just under the first and second toe, as compared with a forefoot striker. And the clues that I gathered clearly indicated that an increased likelihood of a metatarsal stress fracture of the first and second metatarsal heads during running is strongly influenced by how plantar or foot pressure travels over the foot when the foot is in contact with the ground. And it's incredibly important to remember that plantar pressure travel patterns completely differ between a heel strike landing pattern and a forefoot strike landing pattern during running. So let me discuss in further detail what all this means. But the bottom line here is that the plantar pressure distribution pattern unique to heel strike running may be blamed for the high prevalence of metatarsal stress fractures of either the first or second metatarsal head, and may be the core reason first and second metatarsal head stress fractures may be more common in heel strike runners than in forefoot strike runners. I'm going to talk about the differences in plantar pressure distribution patterns between a forefoot strike landing pattern and a heel strike landing pattern during running, and what these differences in plantar pressure distribution patterns mean in terms of influencing a bony injury like a first or second metatarsal stress fracture of the foot. Research, and I've linked the research papers down below in the description box, has identified clear distinguishing differences between plantar pressure distribution patterns in heel strike running versus in forefoot strike running. And it turns out that the way the plantar pressure travels and disperses over the foot in heel strike running, because the heavy impact loads that comes with heel striking during running may be responsible for abnormal doses of stress and pressure loading under the first and second toes, an area not fully physically equipped with the sufficient strength to effectively absorb the heavy volume of plantar pressure that's unleashed or spurred on by the heavy impact loads produced as soon as and after the heel plows into the ground, and that this abnormal surge in plantar pressure under the big toe may cause the first and second metatarsal heads to be very vulnerable to bone fatigue and fracture, especially when running over longer distances or at faster running speeds and intensities with a heavy heel strike landing pattern. In heel strike running, the plantar pressure distribution travel pattern begins at the heel because the heel is precisely where initial ground contact is made on the foot with the ground in a heel strike landing pattern during running. But it's at this point during the initial contact phase on the heel in heel strike running that generates an impact spike that produces high stresses on the heel, and this high stress travels over the foot as soon as the foot rolls over the heel, over the arch, and onto the toes, whereby the intensity of the heel strike impact peak is the main driving force behind the increases in plantar pressure that travels from the heel and ends up piercing through the first and second metatarsal head just under the first and second toe, causing plantar pressure to abnormally disperse in very high volumes in this particular area of the forefoot. But really, why is this a problem? Why would it be harmful to the foot to have high volumes of plantar pressure traveling through and piercing through the first and second metatarsal heads during heel strike running as compared with forefoot strike running? The evidence seems to indicate that the first and second metatarsal heads physically underprovide the capacity to sufficiently absorb or deflect the uniquely high volumes of plantar pressure stress associated with heel strike running. In other words, the area under the first and second toes just aren't fully structurally stable enough to effectively accommodate the exceedingly high volumes of plantar pressures arising from the intensive impact peak force that's uniquely generated in heel strike running and is carried along when the foot rolls over heel to toe, carrying these high plantar pressures in through the foot up through the first and second metatarsal heads. So I really want to underscore and be more specific that greater landing force intensities in heel strike running leads to greater plantar pressure pulses, whereby plantar stress is further compounded and made worse by the magnitude of the peak vertical ground reaction force that's accompanied by landing heel first during running, whereby this force occurs at a magnitude of 3 times the body's weight, which further accelerates high volumes of plantar pressure, really putting the first and second metatarsal heads under strong pressure. In other words, heel strike runners really appear to land more intensively, more aggressively, generating higher doses of impact forces, which can lead to bigger increases in plantar pressure loads on areas of the foot that are anatomically incapable and prove to be a little too delicate to sufficiently manage impact loads of this magnitude. And the net effect is that the plantar stress may overly exceed a tolerable threshold under the mechanical conditions of heel strike running, and thus may be one of the greatest factors of why stress fractures of the first and second metatarsal heads are more prevalent in heel strike runners, but this is not the case for forefoot strike runners, and here's why that is. In forefoot strike running, shown on the right, there isn't large rises in plantar pressure at the first and second metatarsal heads like there is in heel strike running, which is shown on the left. And it's for this reason that forefoot running may be a clinically effective way around the problem of abnormal distribution plantar loading under the first and second toes. And thus, forefoot striking may work best for preventing stress fractures in that particular area of the foot during running. And this is because the flow of plantar pressure distribution travels in a completely different route in forefoot strike running than in heel strike running, and it flows in such a way that the net effect is decreased concentrations of plantar pressures under the first and second toe. Let's take a closer look at the safer, less threatening flow of plantar pressure distribution in forefoot strike running. In a proper forefoot strike landing pattern shown here, initial contact of the foot with the ground is made under the fifth toe, where plantar pressure gets distributed starting from the fifth metatarsal head or under the baby toe. And as the rest of the forefoot comes in contact with the ground, the plantar pressure spreads with better spatial distribution from the fifth metatarsal head to the fourth, third, second, and first metatarsal heads in that order. The vast majority of plantar loads is initially spread out over a larger surface area. That is over the fifth, fourth, and third metatarsal heads, again providing a little more surface area for plantar pressure to evenly distribute, and the bulk of the plantar loads has faded away once the big toe has made full contact with the ground. So this is how the first and second metatarsal heads are less likely to buckle, less likely to overheat with pressure and fatigue because of the stark reductions in plantar pressures on that area provided by a forefoot strike landing pattern. Fundamentally, it's the specific landing configuration of the foot in a proper forefoot strike landing pattern that naturally provides an overall larger surface area for greater spatial distribution, creating a more stable, effective template for a better balance of plantar pressure distribution over the foot, So there isn't a burst of heavy plantar pressure forces on just one section of the forefoot. There isn't heavy plantar pressures being pinned down and heavily localized to an isolated area of the foot like in heel strike running, which can make a big difference in preventing a metatarsal stress fracture during running. More notably, the rapidity or the time of which plantar pressure travels over the forefoot in a forefoot strike landing pattern during running, the net release of plantar pressure is very brief and short in duration. The pressure is basically just there and gone more quickly, which reflects reduced ground contact time of the foot on the ground, which is very necessary for limiting the time for harmful impact forces to accumulate. In other words, the less time the feet spend on the ground during running helps stop increases in heavy plantar loading and other force variables, which is obviously good for injury prevention. Reduced ground contact time of the foot on the ground is a central property of forefoot strike running that makes this style of running less forceful on the body, as it naturally influences a lighter, softer, more brief exchange between the foot and the ground to an extent where you are more well positioned to avoid impact-related injuries. Last but not least, another principal reason that forefoot striking during running may produce plantar pressures that fall within a safer range is because in a forefoot strike landing, there's a complete elimination of the impact peak transient force that's present in heel strike running. As shown above, as you can see, there's the impact transient peak force in heel strike running, and below shows the complete elimination of this impact transient peak in the graph below, showing a forefoot strike landing pattern. Forefoot striking naturally perfectly prevents this impact spike and is sure to be very effective in preventing high plantar loads from flooding the foot, because the lighter the foot interacts with the ground, like in a forefoot strike landing pattern during running, will certainly help scale back impact on the foot, which may be very good for preventing the foot from being bogged down with heavy plantar loads. So I just thought it would be important to emphasize the published data showing that the essential features of a forefoot strike landing during running may lead to better impact protections over the foot as compared with heel strike running, and that forefoot striking may be something that can really help you in your efforts to potentially avoid bony injuries of the foot. I hope you've enjoyed this video. To stay updated on all the latest research on the health and performance benefits of forefoot running and the potential dangers of heel strike running, feel free to hit the subscribe button down below. Thank you so much for listening and watching. Have fun out there on the roads and trails. Bye for now.